Right, welcome back. You're watching the Power Breakfast Show, and this morning our conversation is on the role of civil society, and especially when it comes to governance. This morning we are hosting Mr. Irungo Houghton, who's an associate director, with the Society for International Development, together with Mr. Gojiri Wambogo, his executive director, Change Associates, and of course Mutegi Njau will be leading that conversation. 22422 is the SMS line. You can get us on Twitter. The hashtag is Power Breakfast. For now, I hand you over to Mutegi. Mutegi.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Good morning.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let us look at things in the latest. The perception is that this government seems to be against civil society. You remember when Obama was here a few weeks ago, he emphasized the role of civil society in governance. But our president and the deputy president, the perception of some Kenyans is that they seem to be on the attack against civil society organizations. What is your view about this matter?
I mean, the civil society sector has been in this country maybe for 40 years or more. There are probably three big periods. The first is up until the period of 1991, when the sector was really seen as I guess as an alternative to government in terms of service delivery. At that time, government was not allowed by the World Bank and the IMF to provide education and health services for its population. And at that point, NGOs were playing that role. From 1991 up until about 2003, the sector was involved in a whole range of things. And the other thing we need to recognize about the sector is that you're talking about hundreds of thousands of organizations, probably 20 or so sectors, from agriculture to environment to human rights to governance. So the sector is very diverse. And then the third sector, the third period really has been from 2000 and really from this, I guess what you'd call the period from about 2000 and let's say 2003 up until the present. So there have been many different periods. I think at the moment what I would say is that the sector is a very credible and a legitimate part of the society. It has made a number of important breakthroughs in terms of things. Just to give one example, there was a time when I started in the sector 20 years ago that there was no banking for poor people. If you moved north of I don't know, the northeastern frontiers, we used to call it, there was no banks for people to be able to save money and to be able to invest. And at that time we had organizations like KREP, FAULU and others doing microfinance work to make sure that people could actually save and ensure that when there was a drought they would be able to see themselves pass over that period. That has now been replaced by mainstream banking. And so the work that you see that Equity is doing, for example, across the country, and the other banks, the Barclays and so on, KCB, that was actually started by the sector. Banking for poor people. There are many other examples I can give. We are we're now very happy to see the National Youth Service working in the different urban communities. But what we don't remember is that actually there was a time when there was actually no government services in those communities, and non-formal education, waste and sanitation was all being done by NGOs. So I think to come back to it, I think the sector has first of all been here for a long time. It has made its contribution, and if I talk to over the years, I've probably mentored maybe about 25 young Kenyans, many of whom now work for institutions like IGAD or for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or they're working for government or the private sector. And I think that's the other part of the sector. The sector has actually been a grooming ground and a leadership space for some of the people we even see in the National Theatre, National Theatre, but also the National Assembly as well. I mean, we counted something like about 130 members of Parliament that either worked for NGOs or they have been the beneficiaries of bursary schemes in terms of education. So the sector is not, I think the thing about it, we sometimes get caught in this contestation between the sector and the state and the private sector. What we don't know is that actually there are doors between these three sectors, and people move between these three sectors, including some of our cabinet ministers.
What is your take about this feeling?
I think first I agree with Irungo to a large extent, because what has happened, the Kenyan public believes civil society is a particular group of people. And what has happened, for example, with the president and the deputy president, remember their win was contested by a particular group of NGOs. That were the part of the petitions that were filed in the
the AFRICOM.
Yes, AFRICOM, yes. Which was supported by several other.
Yes.
So there is a running.
Was it wrong?
No, it wasn't. But you see, what has happened is that so you have a particular.
Why would an NGO want trying to It's not, an NGO is not a political party.
No, this is actually where we make a mistake as a nation.
Yes.
We haven't first understood what civil society is, because civil society is that space between government, family, and what they call a market or business. So anybody who operates outside business or government or outside your home, anything you do outside, whether it is your neighborhood welfare group, is a civil society. Whether it is whether you guys have come together to form what do you call it, a waste disposal system in your estate, that's a civil society. But you see, in Kenya, or is it mainstream public discourse represents civil society as those groups that fight government, which is actually what we have come to believe. So for you to be a legitimate civil society person, you must be agitating, or you must be in conflict with the government. And it's so sad, because I have been involved in a lot of conversations about whether civil society should be funded by government, for example. And people say, no, you can't be funded by government. Why should you be funded by government? But we forget that a lot of the civil societies we have here are funded by government, just not our government. When you get a grant from USAID, that is money funded, given by the American government, which has a political ideology, which has a political theory that they're trying to pursue. So when they fund you, when they give you that money, you have to align within a certain ideology. So Kenya has its own ideology. So I don't understand. So we have developed a position that Kenya civil society is any group that fights with government. But we've got people dealing with health. In fact, I did a protest when Obama was coming. And I was glad to see people like Irongo in that meeting finally. Because what had happened is that there was a group of NGOs that had written a letter demanding or asking for a meeting with Obama. And my problem was that particular group represented what you now feel is a fight between government and civil society. And I was saying, you can't just meet this group. You must expand that representation, because this is not just the only.
What your argument then was that the groups that went to meet Obama,
that wanted. Remember,
that wanted.
Yes. There was a letter that was done by a group of 17 NGOs. Specific 17 groups. And in fact, the irony was...
Were they invited or were they not invited?
They asked for the meeting.
Yes.
Then the American embassy said they had actually factored in a meeting in civil society. And our fear was they were going to meet only those 17. Because if they met only those 17, the narrative that they would hear about Kenya and the Kenyan civil society, for me, was going to be slanted on one side. And I was asking, make sure you have a balanced representation of the Kenyan civil society, because if you only have one side, then you're going to hear Kenya is failing and a lot of other things that I don't think is what Kenyan civil society represents as a whole. There's nothing wrong with you standing up and saying Kenya is failing as a civil society. You can take that as your position, but you must also accept that some other NGO is going to stand up and say no, Kenya is working. So you can't close a space and say that the only legitimate NGOs are the ones that say Kenya is failing. We must be able to balance that conversation within the civil society space.
Then why is it that, in view of that,
yes,
this government attempted to, I don't know if they succeed or not, to limit the amount of money it did.
I can talk about
the amount of money that the NGOs can get to 15%. Whereas, as we say, the NGO does wonderful work. Apart from that one, which I think the annoying one was that one, Africa, which went to court because they got money. They don't have their own money. They must have got some money from some government outside Kenya. So they do use that money to go and challenge the election.
Yes.
And that obviously,
I mean,
the government.
I can talk a little bit about that. That was November 2013, and the proposal was brought through maybe about 3 amendments, I think, and then eventually dropped. There has been an act in force since 1991 called the NGO Coordination Act.
Yes.
In 2009, the sector and a number of parliamentarians and the ministry at that point began the process of developing a new act in line with the Constitution. And we knew at that point that the Constitution was coming. We needed to upgrade the, I guess, the legal software around which we manage the sector. And it came through after 4 years of consultation. It became known as the Public Benefits Organizations Act, and was debated in Parliament. It was then assented to by the head of state, then His Excellency President Kibaki, and then it was not implemented. So I think part of the tension still for me is an unresolved legal framework that is still relying on a framework that was essentially adopted back in 1991. This country has moved fundamentally, and the calls for public accountability have gone much higher than they were in 91. I was one of the people who were involved in the Act in 1991, so I remember those provisions very closely. It was a very different period. But this Act has really now, I think we're moving into the third year, has not been commenced. So part of the tension, I think, is that we live in a society where essentially our expectations are that of a Porsche in terms of the CSO sector, in terms of the civil society sector. But we are still operating essentially a pro-box law. And I think part of this tension that we see between state and NGOs would actually subside if we were able to commence the Act. And just to give you 3 examples, great examples of this Act. This Act provides for NGOs to essentially have at least 3 Kenyans on their boards. So there is Kenyan ownership of all the non-governmental organizations that will be operating in this country. The second thing that it does, it actually it requires organizations to publish in the public domain all their auditors' reports and all their annual reports. Now, the previous Act does not require that. So one of the things we've been saying in the sector is please accelerate the commencement of this Act. In fact, it is almost like it's a very bizarre situation that you have a sector begging for a law that has better accountability, you know. And I think this would resolve this. The issue of 15%, I think, is now off the table. And I think it is understood. I likely called it a policy misadventure. I think there were some considerations that were there that were not really thought through very carefully. I think government has seen that. They are now moving to a position that actually we should not be limiting or capping funding coming to this country. We do need to provide oversight. We do need to have NGOs being accountable to the public, particularly the public, the beneficiaries. I worked for ActionAid for many years, and one of the things that we did was we started the culture of social auditing, so that communities could see, if we were funding a non-formal school, you could actually see on a board how much money was coming from ActionAid to that school. That caused a lot of problems for head teachers and even for management committees, because the parents would say, well, where are the books? We see a budget line for books. Where are the books? And I think that's the culture that we need to be inculcating. So on this one, I think, unfortunately, I think government and society, we are actually together on the concept of public accountability, but we are disagreeing on, I guess, the mechanism for how to do that. And as soon as we do that, as soon as the minister in charge of the Ministry of Devolution actually commences the Act, I think 50 to 60% of the tension that you see there, even on issues of governance, will disappear.
Why do you think the government is not implementing it?
I think initially there was that. Let's also be candid. I think the first thing that happened with this government, there's a lot of suspicion of the civil society when they got into power. This particular government, and part of that was because the history, the 3 years before the presidential elections had been like a fight between the personalities in now Jubilee and sections of the Kenya civil society.
Yeah, you remember there was an issue about ICC.
From ICC to going to court to stop certain people from running for office. I mean, it had been a running contest all the way to the actual election, to the results, to the petition. So you can imagine that the elements, and you know, people tend to forget that sometimes it's not the president and the deputy president who are going to make a decision. There are people around them who will decide, "Apana, these guys have been giving us a hard time. We need to first figure out how to manage them." For example, my understanding of the 15% decision was that there were people, especially within the political establishment of Jubilee, who felt up. These guys are getting money from outside that we don't know how much it is, and they're using that money to come and disorganize us. So can we first agree how much money you can get from outside? So that if you're going to, because the people say it was a cap of 15%. The idea was raise money from here. So that the maximum money you can raise from outside is 15%. But it was a completely misadvised, as Irungu says, it was misadvised, because you don't want to reduce, because the money that was coming in comes in to help. I mean, it goes into our economy. Bulk of it. So you really can't reduce it, but you can understand where that concept was coming from. We already have a running fight with civil society, and that is why part of the group that actually went to see the Minister of Devolution, who is herself a product of the civil society, incidentally. People forget that. She's spent a lot of her years in the civil society. And
actually, we should mention the Transparency International.
Yes.
So one of the organizations that government has difficulty with, we actually have a sitting minister who grew from that space.
Yeah. So so the conversations with civil society and government started from the point of, look, we are not all the people you're fighting. In fact, the people you're fighting are a very small percentage of the Kenyan civil society. We have, what, 20 to 30,000 registered civil societies in Kenya. You can't decide, you can't pass a law because you have a problem with 5 or 10 of them. And now you want to manage those 10, and then you completely disempower the remaining thousands. So part of the conversation began from there. The reason I think we still haven't made, we haven't come to a conclusion on that particular law is now that, at what point do we make the mechanics? And then also, let's understand, government moves slowly. When a situation doesn't look like a priority to them, or when they're not sure about the outcome of a particular situation, they're going to keep pushing the decision of implementation, because once it is implemented, it becomes very difficult to go back and change it. So I understand now from a political perspective what is happening with government, why they're dragging their feet. But then also, they need to watch that for as long as they're dragging their feet, the lack of accountability means that you're going to have money coming in to civil society that you don't know where it's coming from. Because there was a gentleman, a foreign NGO person, who was making a comment and said that even in America, you can't go and start an NGO the way you started here. Here people just drive in. You got your workers permit, or you're even here as a visitor. You go to some far-flung country, you come up with a project, you dig boreholes for people, you start raising money abroad, you bring it here. Nobody's actually finding out, you're not answerable to anyone. As long as you're doing something good in society, nobody's going to ask you. Now, you can't do that in most first world countries. They want to know, who are you? Why are you doing this for us? Where are you getting your money from? Why, especially in a time like now when you have terrorism? You've got people coming in, you want to be careful of people coming in with money, starting a project, and then using that project to recruit disenfranchised youth. So we really must get a system that manages our civil society.
What I don't understand is this, that even since the bombing of the American embassy, many NGOs were targeted for that, being associated with Al-Qaeda then, not even Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab was not there.
I didn't exist.
Now, having known that, the way he's talking about, people come here with projects, or some church, or some mosque, or some religion. They don't. Why can't we learn from that and act? Why is it difficult?
I mean, I think if we look back in terms of terrorism, there are probably about 10 organizations that have been identified publicly as having been, and that's from the bombing of the embassy up until date. Many of those have led to closure of organizations, but very few convictions. I think the Interior Ministry needs to take, I guess, oversight very, very seriously in terms of issues of terrorism. My personal view is that we tend to mix these up with a number of different other issues. So, for example, some of the writings that we've seen coming out of government will link, the issues of gays and lesbians with terrorism, or they will link corruption. So you take all three elements like they're the same thing. And for me, what that does is doesn't provide policy clarity in terms of the offices, so that they are clear that actually this threat by Al-Shabaab is real and it is present, and that we need to deal with it very decisively. The other issues are really not issues that, well, corruption is a really important issue, but it is handled differently from a terrorist issue. And then the issue of a sexual minority is definitely not an issue you elevate to a terrorist.
There is a relationship between corruption and terrorism.
Well, once they fuse like that, they can be tackled. But I think not to collapse them. Because
and then also, I think the other thing that we need to look at is terrorism. The fact that you're doing a good thing doesn't also mean you cannot be involved in terrorism. Because that has been an argument I have had, especially with sections of the international community that are arguing when a certain organization is flagged as maybe having links with terrorism, and you say no, but they're doing good work. And you see, for example, the example I gave just now, I can come with $1 million and start doing projects in my local society, but then in the process of doing those projects, what I'm actually doing is identifying disenfranchised young people and indoctrinating them to do something that supports my cause. So it's important for us, and the part about the Interior Ministry taking awareness of the fact that we actually do have a present threat of radicalization, and it's important for us to watch where the sources of radicalization can come from. There was an example of Amnesty International in the UK. Got into a lot of trouble because they were supporting an NGO, a CBO, that was funding caged prisoners that were fighting for the interests of what are they calling them?
I remember this particular.
There's caged prisoners. It's an NGO that ended up being linked with somebody people who are pursuing terrorism activities in the UK. So it's important for us not to blur lines or determine that because I am a good organization, I cannot be associated with terrorism.
You know, Gunjiri, as you're speaking, I'm remembering that back in was it the middle of the 1990s, a number of politicians developed. I was then sitting on the NGO coordination board, and a number of I remember the late, there was a J.M. Shikuku Foundation, there were a number of foundations that were developed, and they came as NGOs. And we sat on the board and we said, you know, but they're not NGOs. Yes. You know, these are essentially foundations that are being created in order to, I guess, support a politician's career to be able to be re-elected in the next election. But actually looking back, I think we were probably short-sighted. Because if we had declared that these were essentially public benefits organizations, and the the Shikuku Foundation provided services and benefits to all people of his constituency without fear or favor, without just saying these are my voters, these are not my voters. As long as it's a public thing, we should have really supported that. Because what we're doing essentially is creating a culture of philanthropy that allows for people who are wealthy, particularly now with 6% growth, people who are wealthy to give back to society. The problem becomes when it is beginning to be used as political, I guess what you'd call patronage, in order to support either a political career or a political party. I think that's where the line for us drops. And we've tried to maintain
all the politicians now, most of them have foundations.
I think it's fine. I think it's fine. As long as they don't say, you voted for me, you can receive a benefit from my foundation. You didn't vote for me, please go and look for your opponent, my opponent's foundation.
There can't be discrimination in a public organization. But then if you're you see, every person who pursues, or most people who pursue civil society work have some other interest. Either you're coming from, for example, I know people who started foundations because they lost a loved one due to a particular disease. So based on that experience you went through, you create a foundation to help fight cancer. Yes. So now that is it's a personal interest.
But those the political ones are just for politics.
But you see, it's just for politics. But what is politics? But you see also, what is politics? Politics has a way of, it's about influencing your local society and bringing benefits. So it's still a grey line. I think as long as there's no discrimination, you can't fight even a political.
Cannot cross. It's true.
As long as there's no discrimination.
That's what the viewers are saying. Some viewers, somebody saying that big civil society organizations receive donors' funds and do very little, while small ones like Operation Condom Panya, something like that.
Operation Condom Panya?
Is something like that. Bunga, Revolution are busy fighting corruption. What do you think about that?
I mean, I wouldn't talk generally like this. I think there are best practices. So one of the best practices within the NGO sector that we have kept for at least the 20 years I've been working there is that no NGO should be essentially dependent on one donor. And this is the point that Gunjiri is raising. If 100% of your funding comes from one donor, it is not only risky in terms of your independence, but actually it's very risky in terms of your sustainability. So best practice is no less than 3 donors, no more than 30% across across each organization. The second thing is that you keep your overheads low. Right now, for most development organizations, we have a practice that anything less, anything more than 30% is actually not best practice. Now, there are a number of organizations that are based on the skills and I guess the talents of the staff. Organizations that train, that do civic education, think tanks and so on. That is slightly different. But even there, we tend to look at to what extent is our salaries and our overheads commensurate with a sector that can be still called a non-for-profit sector, because that's the thing that we have to recognize. This sector was essentially, and in the last act we called it the voluntary sector. Right? I had a very uncomfortable moment about 5 years ago. An intern came to me, and we had been working together for about 4 months, I think it was, and he said to me, Irungo, it was a very awkward moment, I'm really inspired by you. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. I said, thank you very much. What is it that inspires you? He says, you drive a good car, your kids go to good schools, you don't have a house that is leaking. And I thought, it really disturbed me, because I went back and I thought, out of 4 months, if all I have left this young man with is the material benefits that I have accrued out of 20 years of work, then there is something wrong. I have not left him with a sense of purpose and a sense of serving beyond himself. Then there is something wrong there. So I think the other thing about us is there is a level of humility that, yes, it's good. We shouldn't be living large. We're a sector that actually grew out of humble beginnings. And I think in the same way that we challenge the state for using too much resources and going out, they call them expeditions. No, they call them
conferences,
conferences. I think we need to also be held accountable. You know, to what extent are we spending, you know, essentially money for the public on ourselves?
Before we conclude, because I'm told we are running out of time.
So, I thought we were going until lunchtime.
No.
It's called the power breakfast for a reason.
Yes. Does the government have to be concerned about civil society operations in this country? Your view? Do they have to give that perception that there is a fight?
No, I think the narrative of the fight is unhelpful. I think it's unhelpful if we hold it as the sector. I think it's unhelpful if we hold it as the state. We have common issues that really arise from a heightened vision and an ambition around the Constitution. We have committed ourselves to a country that is non-sexist, that is non-discriminatory, that devolves resources to the counties, and also encourages citizens to take action. And I think public participation has to be the focus of all of us. And if we close down the space for dialogue, then all we have left is dissent.
And your view?
My view is that
have to?
No. And especially because if the government takes that position, it's closing itself up to one of the highest intellectual capacity resource sectors it has in the country. Because shilling per shilling, you must probably get a lot more intellectual capacity in the civil society and non-governmental sector than you actually have in public service. Why? Because particular people come around a particular cause. So if, for example, if you want to do agriculture, the NGOs dealing with agriculture have a lot more policy understanding, a lot more intellectual understanding of what you're dealing with. So if government doesn't complement itself, doesn't work with that particular sector, they're going to lose out.
But the government is concerned about governance. They NGOs that question how government is spending money.
And you see, that's now, that particular fight is also important. It's also healthy. It's like the government fighting with opposition. We do need that conflict. But I think what the president said yesterday in Uganda is what we must remember, that the fight you're having must be to build your country, not to destroy it. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. And with those answers, can we go to the other studio and get some music which doesn't seem to inspire some people?
No, we love it.
We love it.
I may stay in the studio.